Most people imagine manipulation as something obvious, a raised voice, a clear lie, someone aggressively trying to control another person. But real manipulation rarely looks like that. The most dangerous manipulators almost never appear aggressive at first. They don't shout, they don't threaten, and they rarely behave in ways that make others immediately suspicious. In fact, many of them seem calm, reasonable, even kind. And that is exactly why their behavior is so difficult to recognize. Because manipulation, at its core, is not about forcing someone to do something. It's about slowly shaping how another person interprets reality. A skilled manipulator doesn't just twist facts. They influence perception. They guide how situations are understood, how emotions are interpreted, and how responsibility is assigned. Over time, this creates a strange and confusing dynamic. The person being manipulated begins to question themselves. They replay conversations in their head. They wonder if they misunderstood something. They start asking themselves questions like, maybe I overreacted, maybe I was too sensitive, maybe it was my fault. What makes this psychological process so powerful is that it rarely happens all at once. It unfolds slowly. At the beginning, everything feels normal. A disagreement happens. One person expresses frustration or discomfort about something that occurred. They try to explain how they feel and why something bothered them. Under healthy circumstances, this leads to a discussion. But when manipulation enters the picture, the conversation often takes a very different direction. Instead of addressing the concern directly, the other person reacts with surprise or offense. They might say something like, "I can't believe you would think that about me." Or, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you see me." Suddenly, the focus of the conversation changes. The original problem disappears. Instead of discussing the issue that was raised, the attention shifts toward the emotional reaction of the other person. The manipulator is no longer responding to the concern. They are responding to the accusation. And this small shift can completely change the emotional balance of the conversation. Now, the person who raised the concern begins to feel uncomfortable. They didn't intend to attack anyone. They simply wanted to talk about something that hurt them. But now the situation feels different. Instead of feeling heard, they suddenly feel guilty. So they soften their words, they try to clarify, they might even apologize for how they said something. And at that moment, the manipulator has already gained an advantage, because the discussion has moved away from behavior and toward emotions. Over time, this pattern repeats itself. Every time a concern is raised, the reaction becomes dramatic or emotionally intense. Arguments become exhausting. Conversations feel unpredictable. What should be a simple discussion turns into something complicated and emotionally draining. And eventually, something predictable begins to happen. The person being manipulated stops bringing things up. They avoid difficult conversations. They keep their frustrations to themselves, not because the problem disappeared, but because addressing it now feels dangerous. This is one of the most subtle effects of manipulation. It slowly teaches the other person that expressing discomfort leads to chaos. And once someone learns that lesson, silence often replaces honesty. But the most disturbing part of manipulation isn't the silence that follows. It's the reversal of roles. Over time, manipulators often begin reshaping the narrative surrounding the conflict. They present themselves as misunderstood. They emphasize how hurt they felt during arguments. They talk about how unfairly they have been treated. And gradually, the story begins to shift. What started as a concern about someone's behavior slowly becomes a story about someone else's accusations. Friends might hear fragments of the situation. Co-workers might notice tension. Family members might observe arguments without understanding the full context. And when people see repeated conflict, they often draw simple conclusions. Someone must be the problem. Without realizing it, they begin to sympathize with the person who appears calmer, more patient, or more emotionally wounded. And manipulators are often very good at presenting themselves that way. They rarely look angry in public. They rarely seem aggressive when others are watching. Instead, they appear composed, reasonable, sometimes even victimized. This is where another psychological mechanism begins to take effect. The person who originally tried to address a problem now begins to question how others see them. They wonder if they seem unreasonable. They start worrying that others believe they are dramatic or difficult, and that fear pushes them even further into silence. At this stage, the manipulation no longer depends only on private conversations. The social environment begins reinforcing the distorted narrative. And this is why manipulation can feel so confusing for the people experiencing it. Because internally, they remember what happened. They remember the words that were said. They remember the behaviors that hurt them. But externally, the reactions around them suggest something else. That contradiction creates psychological tension. The mind tries to resolve it. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it wasn't as serious as I thought. Maybe I am the one making things worse. And once those thoughts begin appearing regularly, the manipulator gains even more control over the situation. Because doubt is one of the most powerful psychological tools a manipulator can use. A person who trusts their perception can challenge manipulation, but a person who doubts their perception becomes vulnerable to influence. And manipulators often rely on exactly that dynamic. Instead of openly defending their actions, they subtly shift attention toward the reactions of others. Instead of explaining their behavior, they question the motives of the person confronting them. Over time, responsibility begins to move in the wrong direction. The manipulator becomes the one who feels attacked. And the person who originally raised the concern begins feeling like the aggressor. This tactic is particularly effective because it blends emotional pressure with social perception. The victim feels internal confusion while simultaneously worrying about how others interpret the situation. And when both forces act together, the psychological impact can be profound. People who experience this kind of manipulation often describe a strange feeling. They remember leaving conversations feeling guilty, even though they couldn't explain exactly why. They remember apologizing even when they were the ones who had been hurt. They remember feeling responsible for conflicts that they didn't start. What makes these experiences so difficult to understand is that they don't resemble traditional forms of control. There are no obvious threats. There are no clear rules being imposed. Instead, the manipulation happens through emotional pressure and subtle shifts in responsibility. And because these shifts are gradual, they are often difficult to recognize while they are happening. Only later, sometimes months or years afterward, do people begin to see the pattern clearly. They start noticing how often their concerns were redirected, how frequently their reactions became the focus of conversations, how many times they walked away, feeling like the villain in situations where they were simply asking for respect. Recognizing this pattern can be uncomfortable, but it can also be incredibly empowering. Because once someone understands how manipulation operates, they become far more capable of identifying it. They learn to pay attention to patterns instead of isolated arguments. They notice when responsibility is constantly redirected. They observe how often certain conversations leave them feeling confused or guilty without clear reasons. And slowly, the distorted perception that manipulation creates begins to lose its power. Because manipulation depends on uncertainty, it thrives when people doubt themselves. But when someone begins trusting their perception again, the dynamic changes. Conversations become clearer, boundaries become stronger, and the manipulator loses the psychological advantage that confusion once provided. Understanding this process doesn't mean every conflict is manipulation. Healthy relationships involve disagreements, misunderstandings, and emotional reactions. But in healthy relationships, concerns are discussed openly, responsibility is shared, and both people remain accountable for their behavior. Manipulation, on the other hand, follows a different pattern. Responsibility is constantly redirected. Concerns are reframed as accusations, and slowly the person asking for respect begins to feel like the one causing harm. Once you learn to recognize that pattern, something interesting happens. Situations that once felt confusing start making sense. You begin to see the subtle shifts that redirect blame. You notice when conversations move away from behavior and toward emotional pressure. And most importantly, you begin to understand that feeling like the villain in someone else's story does not necessarily mean you are one. Sometimes it simply means someone has been very skilled at controlling the narrative.